You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to Rethreading Madness.
When I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do, when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Ahana Mulgaonker. Did I say your name right, Ahana?
Yes, you did.
Okay, good. Even though we talked about it just before we came on air, I still, when I said it, I thought, I'm not sure. So thank you.
Yeah.
Ahana has written an essay called Tenderly Borderline, and it argues that borderline personality disorder, which we don't usually use that term here, but just because we're talking about a diagnosis, and other personality disorders, should be understood not as individual pathology, but as an embodied response to structural violence. Ahana has traced how her own BPD diagnoses emerges from intersecting forms of oppression, so immigrant displacement, upper caste Indian family dynamics, childhood abuse, heterosexism, and ableism. She introduces the term PD phobia. Is that kind of a good summary of your essay? I know we're going to get into the
Yes.
here in a minute.
So the essay you're speaking about is called The Politics of Vulnerability, but it's housed on a blog that is called Tenderly Borderline.
Oh, thank you for that clarification.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you wanted to say about who you are?
Just that I'm not part of academia. I write outside from the margins of academia, I would say. I think in large part because work on madness is still a bit marginalized within academic institutions, especially those that talk about experiences that are labeled as personality disorders. So I refer to myself as an independent scholar or writer. But yeah, I write mainly through my blog, but I have had some publications in Asylum Magazine, which is a Mad Studies publication in the UK.
Right.
But that's just generally what I do.
And are you located in the United States or in the UK?
Yes, I'm located in Austin, Texas, in the United States.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you tell us what PD phobia is?
So PD phobia, well, the most obvious answer would be to say is discrimination and marginalization that affects people diagnosed or labeled with personality disorder. It's a specific type of political power that's directed at people who are diagnosed with those categories. But I would also expand it to mean a larger type of avoidance or of trauma and in states of woundedness in our society. I think generally, especially in American society, there is kind of a very much a fear or a type of disgust that's directed at people who are seen as wounded and whose wounds are displayed openly and is visible. And so I think oftentimes American society or societies in general are very keen on shepherding a lot of woundedness out of view, out of sight, and personality disorders serve that function to, first of all, absolve society of ethical responsibility towards the wounded by blaming the wounded themselves as being responsible for. So I see it as a type of victim blaming. Personality disorders, I think, are a form of victim blaming, and it also misidentifies what's going on and as being rooted in the body, mind, or the body of the individual, rather than in the structural issues that end up, being the reason why sometimes we struggle with certain vulnerabilities or certain wounds. That it's these structures that or the conditions that allow, for example, for me to experience things like paranoia or splitting, what they call splitting, but. So people focus so much on like the individual, and don't look at the broader structural issues that are at play that 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 make possible experiences that we label as personality disorders. So I'm all about shifting away from the medical model, the individual model that focuses on the individual, and look at the larger societal issues that are at play when it comes to personality disorders and trauma in general and madness.
Yeah, you really do talk about the pathologizing of trauma and how that is used to oppress people. And like you said, by diagnosing them with a personality disorder, it kind of is a way of allowing the system to avoid being confronted
Continue.
about the way
Yeah.
that they are actually perpetrating or perpetuating these harms.
Yeah. Yeah, and I talk about in my essay that, the types of politics that are at play, social and political issues that are at play with personality disorders, have a lot of intersectional potential for analysis because personality disorders are people who are diagnosed with them cut across social differences, and that's mainly because they pathologize the way people respond to various systems of power, so it ends up reaffirming and reimplanting other types of power because it kind of seeks to remove from view embodied responses to very unbearable political realities. Like for me, some of the realities that I experienced as a kid, which kind of formed the background for a lot of my trauma, is heterosexism and ableism, and by diagnosing me with a personality disorder and making that the whole issue is like what the behaviors I have now as being the whole issue. It removes from consideration or interrogation, the heterosexism and ableism that kind of that are at play. It kind of redirects our attention away from those types of power and focus merely on the individual. So it ends up, naturalizing oppression, rather than letting us ask questions about, if someone's struggling with their emotions, why are they struggling with their emotions? What processes establish this type of experience? Um, it naturalizes and sustains our investment in power by like kind of casting our responses to it as being disruptive or problemed or troubled,
Right.
rather than being really responses that are the natural result of having a, a world that is so violent to so many people and so intolerable, and our bodies can respond you know in ways that kind of that kind of make sense when we're faced with these type of realities that are consistently throughout our lives.
You use words like heterosexism and ableism, and all of those things bring up the idea that being white and being straight and being able-bodied is seen as good and right. And if you are not those things, you are seen as either needing special treatment or needing to conform with
Yeah.
what is right and good. And so if that's where we're at, then what ends up happening is we're asking people to, what's the word? I'm figuring this out in my head as I go along. We're asking people to deny who they are and to replace it with something they're not. And somehow that's okay because, i.e., quote unquote, it's right and good.
Yeah, and I opened this essay with a quote from a disability poet, Aurora Levins Morales, who basically talks about how all the ways in which people's being that who they are is called wrong or
Right.
called defective or deviant. All those ways that we're made to feel like we are somehow at fault or wrong for who we are, all
Mhm.
those ways are connected. And in the ways that people diagnosed or labeled personality disorders are called wrong for how they are suffering and how they respond to oppression, that is connected to the same ways that we're all called wrong for who we are or for how we're responding to the world. Whether it's someone with like whether it's a trans person or whether it's a disabled person or anyone really who is called wrong for being who they are, or how their body mind exists, and comports in the world.
Mm-hmm.
That's all connected, and I think personality disorders, reveal that, that 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 I think, sometimes people with these diagnoses are kind of excluded from the area of like legitimate, people who are considered actually oppressed, or people who actually, deserve liberation. But I would say that people diagnosed with personality disorders really showcase all the ways that people are held or told they're wrong, and how they're held responsible for their own mistreatment and their own oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And when we kind of recognize that people diagnosed with personality disorders are, just as human as the rest of us, just as vulnerable and wounded as the rest of us, we kind of we kind of, realize that, you know, that what's at stake, what's really our enemy, is not each other's emotions, but the types of power that end up exploiting and magnifying, our vulnerabilities and our woundedness and our living being, making taking advantage of it, and not treating it, with an ethical, kind of mindset.
Do you find a distinction between, or do you make a distinction between somebody who has a mental health challenge and somebody who has a personality disorder?
Well, the whole point of why I use the term vulnerability, and try to call the wounds that people diagnosed with personality disorders have, or as vulnerabilities, is because I'm trying to dissolve these distinctions between diagnoses,
Mm-hmm.
because I definitely say that people with the label of personality disorder have a very intensified form of vulnerability, but we all have vulnerabilities. We're all imperfect. We all have wounds, we all
Mm-hmm.
have ways that our hurt shows up in the world. And, by separating it out, by creating this whole category of vulnerability that's separate from the rest of humanity, it kind of it kind of disavows this woundedness that we all have, So I hope ideally in the world, in the future, we get rid of, these separations between vulnerability, and try to recognize that we're all vulnerable in so many ways, and try to realize that the ways we take care of our vulnerabilities are all interconnected and depend on one another. And so I hope we talk about personality disorders in terms of vulnerabilities rather than disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And
No, I like that.
we don't just say that people with these diagnoses are vulnerable, but we all are, whether we're sane or not. We all have wounds, we all struggle. And I think sanity really is about disavowing the pain and the suffering that's really at the core of the human experience,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of pathologizing and rejecting it. And for me, I think what's important is accepting these wounds, accepting, all the distress and the suffering that happens, and trying to put it in its context, which is types of power that take advantage of it and magnify it and make it much harder than it really should be. I think it makes things, you know, I feel like, so I don't know. I feel like our enemy is not our negative, so-called negative emotions. It's the ways, our emotionality is kind of, hurt by power, and and our hurt that develops from that tells us a lot. It carries a lot of information. Our wounds, our distress carries a lot of information because it tells us, what's wrong. Because when we're distressed, we think that there's something wrong, but usually the wrongness is told that it's us that's wrong. But
Right.
in reality, I think the distress is telling us that there's something socially wrong, that there's something structurally wrong, there's something wrong in the ways our lives are being forced to be by society. And so I think distress tells us not about something that's wrong about us, but what's wrong with the world in which we live, and the world that we're kind of, you know, made to function in.
And do you see that or maybe that's the wrong word. Um when you're talking, I think this would be wonderful if we could do this. And then I plunk it into the current social construct that is out there that really truly is slanted towards ensuring power remains with those who have power, and those who harm can continue to harm. It actually, victim blaming works for people, and it works for society because
Yes.
they can blame one person who's probably usually the one with the least amount of power, And the person who has the most amount of power, who might hurt them or might cause them
Yeah,
problems, they don't have to address or confront or
yeah,
take away their power, right? And so
yeah.
it keeps the status quo going. So how do you see what you're proposing? How do you see that actually happening within the social construct? What needs to happen for us to get there?
Well, first I wanted to speak on what you just said is that I think it's very easy to blame the crazy or the insane
Yeah.
person,
Yeah.
because we're kind of by nature of where we're placed in society, we're thought to be irrational, and it's very easy to blame the person who doesn't make sense. But I feel like sane people need to evaluate, how like I think they need to interrogate their own subjectivity, their own ways of thinking and relating and being, and instead of always interrogating madness and saying being critical of madness, and madness is what's wrong, it's the wrong way to relate, it's the wrong way to think and feel. I think sane people need to interrogate themselves and interrogate that sanity naturalizes a lot of status quo things, and madness kind of rebels against us and says that the status quo isn't right. It doesn't make me feel good. It doesn't make me feel um, you know the way that same people are feeling, so yeah. But I think when it comes to like creating a world where we kind of confront power instead of relegating responsibility to the people who are victimized or hurt by it, I think that first starts by interrogating oneself, because I think um, you know, we need to interrogate the ways that we reproduce power, social power, and how we are implicated in
Yeah.
power, whether or not we have a personality disorder. People like to say that people diagnosed with a personality disorder are somehow more likely to be a
Yeah.
CEO or whatever, that these people are personality disordered. But I think what that does is ends up preventing contemplation about how we're all implicated in power, whether or not we have a diagnosis or not. We're all complicit in some form of power, whether or not we're diagnosed with it,
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I mean, power comes
so
in very many forms.
yeah, so I think people are very quick to blame people with these diagnoses, but they don't. First of all, I would dispute the fact that people with these diagnoses are more likely to be in positions of power. I think people with these diagnoses tend to be more precarious and more on the margins of society.
Right.
But even if you buy that people with these diagnoses are tend to be in positions of power, that doesn't dispute the fact that this is nothing unique about it, because whether you're sane or mad, we're all implicated in forms of power. And
Yeah.
I think in a world where we kind of confront power instead of blaming each other, I think that first we have to look inward and evaluate the ways we are involved in
Yeah.
power, and instead of focusing so much on the other and how the other is the demon or the enemy, but
Right. Right.
but
Exactly.
and focus more inward, and I for me ethics, the difference between ethics and morality is that ethics interrogates what is ethical. Morality just looks at what is dominant, the social values, and says this is what is moral. But
Right.
ethics is about interrogating what we receive as moral. Like we are taught a lot of things about what's moral. Being ethical is about interrogating those things, interrogating the assumptions we have when we enter into relations with people, and interrogating the ways that we are complicit in, certain forms of power, and using that interrogation or that criticalness about how we relate to people as a foundation of how we approach other people.
Yeah, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to blame the blameless and then turn a blind eye. And I don't mean that in terms of disability, but to not look at the violence that that is being caused by others. It just becomes easier. And we really need to find a way, like you said, to make that leap into interrogating ourselves and looking at what is morally right.
Yeah, yeah,
We just need to take a
yeah.
little break here, Ahana, but we'll be right back, folks, with Ahana and this incredible conversation.
Co-op Radio 100.5 FM, Vancouver's community radio station for 50 years. With great local music, arts, public affairs, many languages, and all kinds of great stuff. Support us for our spring membership drive at www.coopradio.org and learn how to become a member today.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm having a conversation with Ahana Mulgaonker. I'm sorry if I said that wrong.
No,
Um,
that's okay.
about vulnerability and personality disorder and how all of that plays out in our society. In your essay, Ahana, you use the term reification to describe how complex social relationships get flattened into personality traits. Can you walk me through, say, an example from your own experience or one that you know of from someone else where you've seen how this happens in real time or with specific people or specific moments?
Well, reification, let me just give a backstory of what reification
Sure.
is. Reification is a concept from Marxism, from Marxist theory, that basically it was first applied to the idea of the commodity, that basically the complex social relations, obviously I'm not an expert on Marxism, but basically what it is that the complex histories and social relations that produce a product are kind of erased and perceived in displaced form in the value of the commodity, so when we buy an iPhone, we're not thinking about the sweatshops or the ways the lithium is mined or things like that. We just see the price tag, we just see the shiny iPhone. We don't see the complex types of power and social relations that go into producing an iPhone.
Hmm.
And so over time philosophers have kind of tried to look at it beyond commodities to individuals, to the formation of identity. Foucault, for example, talked a lot about how identities are formed, how subjectivities or like how we feel as like our internal feeling of ourselves, are formed. And reification functions through that in the way that we're all shaped by systems of power and social relations and histories. We're historical beings, but when we interrelate with one another, we don't perceive all those histories or those systems of power. We perceive, certain attributes, about us. Um, so for example, sex, for example, we oftentimes in interpersonal relations, people operate through certain gender roles, but we don't look at the larger social relations that produce gender roles and enforce it and make it into a kind of normative standard. We just relate to someone as a man or a woman. So similarly, personality disorders, when we interact with someone with a diagnosis, oftentimes we focus so much on behaviors or the way they're appearing socially in the situation, or what they're saying or doing, but we're not looking at what are the conditions of possibility, or what are the historical circumstances or the political circumstances in which anything that happens in this interaction has meaning. So reification ends up being where we focus so much on this apparent defective attribute of the individual, this individual like attribute of the person, maybe their personality, but we don't look at, the systems of power that are at play. It's distilled in the individual rather than broadening it out to the larger social context.
Hmm.
Um, so basically, what that does is it ends up erasing our ethical responsibility to those histories of trauma and those histories of oppression, because all we're doing is focusing on the individual and detaching the individual from those structures of power. And so as a result, when we interact with someone with a diagnosis, oftentimes people, don't think about, their own ethical, responsibility in the situation. And I talk about and say how the past is erased from the obligations of the present.
Right.
There's kind of a separation where everything that happened in childhood doesn't matter. And the ways that we're all complicit in the types of power that caused all that childhood trauma. Like we're all complicit in ableism and heterosexism in some way.
Hmm.
So that type of so the childhood is erased from consideration. And it just people just focus on the present day appearance, of how those complex histories kind of, impinge on the present, instead of trying to think about how our ethics are not just rooted in how an individual appears in a particular moment, but it's also rooted in all the dynamics and histories and relations that are kind of conditioning that present in that moment and in the individual that's appearing before us. So for me, I think ethics is very historical and political rather than something that's interpersonal, just interpersonal. I think we have to think about the historical and political dynamics, and when we're relating with anyone, regardless of diagnosis or whether they're mad or not.
And can you do that regardless of whether or not you know that person's history?
Yeah, in fact, I think that's kind of the important part about it is that we never know how a person is affected by power.
Right.
We don't have a complete history about the way they're situated in society, but we do have a complete view about how we're situated in society and what our assumptions that we have about how people should or should not behave. And I think part of it is part of it goes back to disability studies is like universal accessibility. It doesn't matter what the medical diagnosis of someone is. We build a society where where accessibility is given regardless of diagnosis. So I think it's about changing our perspective of what is normative or what should happen in society and try to look at more about what are the specific needs and contexts that I'm immersed in rather than imposing a certain standard that's universal. So I don't know. I think a lot of it comes down to that, when we're relating to anyone, I think should be rooted in the individual experience, the individual needs of the context, rather than making a universal standard of how people should behave universally throughout society. It's about the social context and the specific needs of the people involved. So I think part of that is interrogating the norms and the types of standards that we bring into any interaction. And I think regardless of whether or not we have a complete picture of someone's trauma history, I think, we definitely have the ability to interrogate the norms and the standards and the types of discourses and beliefs we're bringing into any interaction with any person.
Mm-hmm. And so how would that work, say, in a friendship where you're getting to know somebody? How would you bring into that accessibility and an ethical norm that does not impose power?
Well, I
Is
think
that the right question? Maybe that's a wrong question.
yeah, I think you're asking a very important question. I think part of it is that we're at a point discursively and historically where we don't have a lot of tools. I think because the way society is kind of developed at this point, we're kind of don't have a lot of the tools to relate with people who are mad or have these diagnoses. I think psychiatry has kind of limited our imagination socially, and large part of the project of MAD studies is about expanding our imagination, expanding what tools we have with relating to madness that isn't just psychiatric or psychological. That there are other ways we have the ability to create these new tools, and I think we're in the process of developing those tools, those models, those techniques. But I think it starts with a radical openness, and kind of and radical compassion, that kind of doesn't like I think it's kind of being curious and open about how about a person's behavior instead of just immediately ascribing a certain social norm to it. We are curious about why is a person behaving in a certain way. What are the ways that maybe we're exacerbating it or social structures are exacerbating it, and how can we develop both collective and structural ways of supporting a person in distress, and also how can we respond in a way that doesn't make it worse. And
Right.
I think oftentimes rejecting distress or repudiating it and casting it aside kind of makes it much worse. It makes the phenomenon of distress collectively and individually worse. So for me, I think part of it is not, instead of like casting away distress, but embracing it as a condition in our society. It's instead of pretending it doesn't exist or shouldn't exist, is accepting that everyone gets distressed, and everyone gets distressed for different reasons and in different frequencies. and and instead of trying to incarcerate it um, or seclude it from society, we kind of recognize that distress is an important part of our collective experience, and it tells us a lot about society. And instead of casting it aside, we work politically, collectively, structurally to change you know society so that distress is something that can be supported, and also that it's something that's not being forced upon people in very dire circumstances and very unthinkable circumstances.
Right.
So yeah, I think we're developing the tools, we're mobilizing collectively to make it so that people in distress are supported, and we're, instead of blaming people, we're changing the structures that exacerbate distress.
And we need to do that. I mean, but as you're talking, I am seeing in my head where society is structured right now, which is they don't want to see the distress. They don't want to see the anxiety. They want to medicate it. They want it to
Yeah.
be
They want to seclude
quiet.
it.
They want to seclude it. They want to change it. They want to silence people so
Yeah.
um, they're not distressed by it themselves. It's really a sad state of affairs when you
Yeah.
realize that, we're blaming victims, and we are, basically saying that any way you respond to being victimized is not okay. And we want you to go around and act like you're normal when that
Yeah.
is,
It's
then that
yeah.
is actually not normal, really,
Yeah,
when you look at it.
it's a very backward logic where the same power that hurts people also demands orderly emotional responses to that hurt, you
Right.
know? Like I talk about how emotional regulation, this norm of emotional regulation, is all about ensuring people the hurt that the system causes conforms to that same system, doesn't
Right.
interrupt or disrupt that system, that social system. So the social system hurts us, and then it also says that we need to respond in certain ways that conform and uphold and maintain that system. So
Yeah.
I think the reason why distress is so alarming to some people is because they're invested in that system, because they depend on that system. A lot of the ways they feel and think and interact are conditioned and dependent on that system. And when distress erupts and showcases that system is all messed up and is hurting people, or it kind of challenges them in a way that they're uncomfortable with, and they end up blaming the person who's distressed rather than looking at, why is this making me uncomfortable? It's because we're shaped by a social system that hurts people, and what I'm witnessing is that hurt happening in real time.
Right.
And so whenever I see a distressed person, I part of that is recognizing that what's at stake is not the distress of the person, but the systems of power that are distressing all of us in
Right.
many ways. Um, so I think all of our distress is interconnected, and our enemy is the types of power that make it worse, not each other because we're distressed. Like I really think there's artificial divisions that are erected between us because of our vulnerability, because of our trauma, because of our distress, and those divisions that keep us apart, because are meant to prevent us from resisting power. And so I really hope in the future trauma and distress and emotional dysregulation doesn't keep us apart, but becomes ways for us to mobilize together to challenge the structures that make us distressed and dysregulated.
Mhm. No, I agree. And part of what you're talking about reminds me of a conversation I had with somebody recently who was clearly racist, but didn't see their racism. They just
Yeah,
felt that indigenous people, so long as they pretended to be white and acted white, were okay, right? And couldn't see the racism in what they were saying. And it's kind of the same thing that you're talking about in terms of people who are distressed or have been victimized in some ways. People are coming along and saying, well, so long as you can act like somebody who hasn't been victimized, you will be okay.
yeah,
And it
yeah.
really is.
It's impossible too. Like, I think it poses a standard that no one's able to meet. I don't think, um, like for all the rationality that Sandy has, I that seems like a very preposterous expectation. That when someone is hurt, they're going to feel it. And if they hide it, it's going to show up in other ways.
Yeah.
Um,
And that is
and
what our society asks. Hide it.
yeah,
And we do see the harm that comes from hiding it. And that
yeah,
is another, it's just another hurt that we're adding on top of.
yeah.
We just need to take a little break, Hannah, but we'll be right back, folks.
Hey, this is Mark Kiliansky from Golden Shoals. In a world where things are constantly fed to us through a screen, through an algorithm, independent radio offers music and playlists made by friends, neighbors, and humans. I love it so much, and I really want everybody to continue to enjoy that in these modern times. Forget Spotify, forget YouTube. Listen to Co-op Radio, 100.5 FM and coopradio.org.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm speaking with Ahana Mulgaonker about her paper on vulnerability. I'm sure that's not the full title, but you can give us the full title when we're finished here.
Yeah, sure.
You have a term in your paper called Childism, and it sounds to me that you kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I've misunderstood this, that childism is sort of the foundation of other oppressions, and that pedophobia, I probably said that wrong. I'm not saying pedophilia, I'm saying pedophobia, is
Yeah.
a continuation of that into adulthood. Can you talk a
Yes.
little bit about that?
Yes. So childism comes from a type of social theory that's on the rise, but is not as mainstream. And basically, childism is the oppression of children. And one thing that I think has gone unrecognized in society is about how children are oppressed. This lack of agency that we ascribe to children, I think, is a sign of agency being taken away from them. And so, like, I talk a lot about how the stakes of trauma is not just the types of liberation we try to acquire for people who are traumatized, but also the stakes are how children are traumatized in the first place. And I think the types of power that adults wield over children through the nuclear family and the ways that the state institutionalizes that power, that ultimate power that adults have, ends up creating the conditions for childhood abuse and trauma. And I say that the power that adults wield over children is the foundation for all forms of oppression, because adult identity is formed in a childhood saturated with power, with power that's wielded over oneself as a child, and all the types of power that are deployed against a child depend on this idea the child is somehow a less um, a less formed individual than an adult. That this idea that adults are these fully formed, fully free, apparently actors in social life, whereas children are malformed adults. Less their biology is not fully formed, and thus, as a result, they should have less agency and less autonomy, less rights, less freedom, less power over themselves, less self-determination. And so all the types of power that are directed at a child depend on this idea that the child is somehow inferior to an adult,
Mm-hmm.
less of a person, less of their own subject, their own being. And so the type of ownership that adults have over children, I think, is the foundation for lots of type of power that ends up articulating with the child. Like ableism depends on the idea that the disabled child is under the power of the adult.
Right.
So, and PD phobia is a continuation of that childism, because that childism harms the child, it hurts the child, it traumatizes the child, it wounds the child. And so when that child becomes an adult, PD phobia ends up covering the tracks of childism. It erases this history of anti-child power. So what I think, my opinion is that childism and PD phobia is like a continuum. Where childism happens when you're a child, it's the types of forms of power that hurt us as children. Well,
Hmm.
PD phobia is the way in which people are diagnosed with personality disorders to cover up the tracks of childism and protect the power of adults. And
Mm.
so I think as adults with trauma, I think we have a lot of power and agency to advocate for children,
Yeah.
because we kind of reveal the effects of the types of power that adults have over children. We
Yeah.
reveal the very extreme effects that that type of adult power has. So I think mental illnesses in general, a lot of them are about protecting, power, about protecting the power that adults have and preventing or reckoning with the ways in which children are being harmed continuously all over the world, all over, and how that harm against children is very foundational to the social order, and how people develop into political and social subjects.
Right.
I think that power is very foundational to that, progression of people into normative political, like, being a
I'm
political actor, you know.
I'm gonna give an example, and you can tell me whether or not how this fits and where it doesn't fit.
Okay.
Um, Schools, right? We have schools made to train children to become certain kinds of adults, and I have a neurodivergent grandchild that I raised and was not really thriving. This is an understatement. Was not thriving in regular high school. And I put her in a school that all of my friends said was out of control. The kids don't learn anything. They're not made to sit down. They're not made to learn anything. They're not given any subjects to learn. They're just told, whatever you want to learn, you just tell us and we will teach that to you. And they built the curriculum around what the child wanted. And people had a really hard time with this. I had my own fears about this, but I put my child there because there was no other option. And she thrived. And not only
Yeah.
did she
Yeah.
thrive, but I started hearing stories about how kids weren't reading by grade 3, but by grade 4, they just picked up books and read. Like nobody taught them to read, but they
Yeah.
learned, they had figured it out by themselves, absorbing it from the school culture. And the other thing that has happened from that is that the kids that have come out of that school, that my child still knows now at 27, are some of the most responsible children I've ever met. They are,
Yeah.
they're grounded. They can articulate what they want. They can express their feelings. They're going to college. They are doing stuff in a way that other children aren't.
Yeah.
And so how does that fit in? I mean, to me, that seems like an example of what you're talking about. Am I?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that a proposition like that, going to that school, is boggles a lot of adults' mind, because they think that children have no power, no agency, they can't do anything without an adult telling them to do it.
Mm,
And so I think it's very important that we recognize that children are people, they're
yeah,
persons with their own, wants and interests and desires. And just because they're children does not mean that that's invalid or, or wrong. And I think we will really benefit as a society if we give more self-determination to children. I think that will um, lessen the likelihood of childhood abuse and adults getting away with that childhood abuse. If children are taught that they have the right to determine their lives and the right to say what is acceptable to them and what's not acceptable to them,
okay,
and teaching them that they have boundaries as children, and that adults can't violate those boundaries, just like,
yes,
so I think all that is very important to recognizing that children are their own people, they're their own person, and not just the subject to the power or agencies of the adults, and
Right.
that I think we really I think society really under like kind of devalues and um, kind of underestimates children.
Oh, absolutely. I
And
agree
I
with
think
you.
that underestimation of children protects people who are out to harm children, I
Yes.
think.
Or
So we
even
need to,
just do harm children without necessarily meaning to, but they're reenacting something
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that happened to them.
Yeah, I think oftentimes the types of trauma that happens to children, um, you know, like people often say people diagnosed with personality disorders, when they have children, they abuse children, but I don't see that. I don't see that type of interpretation as dependent on someone's psychology, but the type of asymmetry of power that's between adults and children.
Hmm.
Like if like I think any type of abuse that a mad person is apparently supposed to have done towards a child, I think is less to do with their madness and more to do with types of asymmetry of power that adult has over children, whether or not they're mad or not.
Right.
Um, so like I think it has less to do with them. Like for example, um, people in my family say my dad who abused me, my wasn't was someone with NPD, with narcissistic personality disorder. And it would be very easy like to just say that he abused me because he had NPD. Um, and many people do follow that path and they blame it on a putative diagnosis. But for me, what's more important is the types of power he had over me, not his psychology. It's the ableism and the heterosexism and the types of authority that he had as a adult father over a child who was queer and disabled,
Right.
and the types of misogynistic beliefs he had that kind of influenced how he wielded that not that power that's automatically given to adults. Like adults are automatically given more power, and so sometimes heterosexism, ableism, things like that end up influencing the ways that they use that power. And so for me, it has nothing to do with psychology. It has everything to do with the ways he, as an adult, was given authority over me and rights over me, and how his misogyny and ableism influenced the ways he used that automatic authority that's given to him.
Right. You write about language as an enemy that, quote, lives in your wounds. Is that, did I get that right?
Yeah, so I talk about how towards the end of that essay, I write kind of like a small prose poem where I talk about how a language lives in my wounds and it's my enemy, but it's not the enemy that you think. It's not my emotional dysregulation. It's not, the types of self-harm I have, but it's the language that turns all those, suffering that I experience as it turns it against me as an enemy. So I talk about how a language uses my vulnerability against me as as witness against me. So I think that oftentimes when we have trauma, the ways that we're hurt is used against us as evidence that somehow we're wrong, or somehow our testimony is somehow invalid because of our trauma.
Hmm.
Um, and so I talk about how there's a language that turns this vulnerability as into an enemy against me, and I think that goes back to something I don't talk a lot about in this essay, about the alienation of vulnerability, how we're alienated from the ways we're hurt. We're kind of separated from it, or kind of like almost like in the capitalist type of alienation, like we're kind of not connected with it, and instead it's turned against us as a weapon against us, as something wrong about us, and why and rationalizes why we should be less than or inferior. So I think a large part of liberation for us is reclaiming our vulnerability, reclaiming our wounds and our distress and our pain, and saying this is an integral part of us, and it's not something that makes us wrong or something that should be cured or removed from us, but it's something that's very valuable, and it tells us a lot of information about our experiences, about the world, about where we are, and using that information. Like Audre Lorde talks about the erotic as power, and I think distress is part of the erotic as power. It's not just joy. Joy tells us a lot. It tells us a lot about what about our lives makes it worth living and something that makes it livable for us. Joy is where we're headed. But distress also tells us what is not okay about our lives. And that's as valuable, because it's as valuable information for us when we're trying to fight oppression, is what's not okay about power, about society. And distress tells us that information. So I talk about how instead of about reclaiming the use of language about our vulnerability, like there's a language that turns our vulnerability into a weapon against us, but we also have the agency to use a language to change our relationship to vulnerability as something that is ours, and it's ours to use as information and energy in our fight against power. And that power doesn't have to take it away from us and use it as a weapon against us, but it's something ours to speak and talk about and use as information, and I think that's what I was trying to get at later in that essay.
Well, I just want to say that you have spoken it well here, and I so appreciate you coming and talking with us about this.
Of course.
Your paper, the information in your paper is very valuable. Where can people find your essay and other things that you've written?
So I have a blog. It's called Tenderly Borderline on Substack. And I write a lot about the liberation of people diagnosed or labeled with personality disorders. I also talk about madness in general, including a new type of theory in politics that I'm trying to formulate called anti-sanity, which kind of extends anti-psychiatry to the broader types of social norms and sane types of power that's deployed against mad people. But you can find me on tenderlyborderline.substack.com. That's where almost all my writing is housed. You can also find me on Blue Sky at antisanitygirl.bluesky.social. And you can find me on Instagram at antisanitygirl as well. But I hope that I was able to communicate what I'm trying to do with my work and trying to create a more livable future for mad people, so we don't have to deal with a society that's really antagonistic to us.
Right, I agree, and I think you are. So thank you, Ahana, and we'll be right back, folks.
Tanuyap, Quiget Yuans Quiensna. Hi everybody, my name is Quiget Yuans. I'm a member of the Squamish Nation and the Yagalanas clan of the Haida Nation. You're listening to Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We live, work, play, and broadcast from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
I was born in Venezuela. I was a happy kid, but then my mother and I moved to another country. She got a man, she did it all for me. So I helped my mother to write her emails in Swedish. She didn't speak it, neither did I. Lost my mother language, was called a gringo, while I'm Latino, but sometimes I'm not. I just really wanna say it, but it's hard to tell you. Who I am, what do I like, what do I do well, yeah. Am I even looking for an answer? How am I supposed to fit into a world like this? No, I ain't never wanna fit into a world like this. No, I ain't got nowhere to run or hide. Where should I? How could I? I ain't just the cold ones. I was the brown one, only a few ones wanted to play. The rest didn't like me, my look or singing. Thank me for dreaming, cause I never stopped. I just really wanna say it, but it's hard to tell you who I am, who do I like, what do I do well, yeah. Am I even looking for an answer? How am I supposed to fit into a world like this? No, I never wanna fit into a world like this. No, I ain't got nowhere to run or hide. Why should I? How could I? I never wanna fit into a world like this. No. How am I supposed to fit into a world like this? Yo soy venezolano, hablo perfecto español y sueco, inglés también. Espero que mis sueños no me fallen y que Dios me guarde hasta el final.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and that's our show. I'm going to warn you that as I am rounding out this program, I am almost losing my voice, so bear with me. My thanks to Ahana Mulgaonker for sharing her unique perspective on the issues of childhood trauma, vulnerabilities, and the diagnoses that include personality disorders. If you want to read her essays, you can find her under the term Tenderly Borderline on Substack or Anti-Sanity Girl on Instagram. Music today was by Sherry Ulrich and Omar Rudberg. And to you, our listeners, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. You've just listened to Rethreading Madness, where we dare to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. This is Bernadine Fox. We'll be back next week. Until then.
When I've never been further, knowing what the hell I'm gonna do. When I can't seem to find my way, under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making it up. Why don't I ever think of that? It's some kind of magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Everything's gonna be alright. With anyone else, it's such a cliche, just words people say to be nice. Or somehow